great pleasure to introduce Peter Layton tonight. Now, I've just while I bought my glasses, I'm reading this off my mobile phone.
Big brief.
Mate, with your resume, I can't do that very good. Peter's a long-term member here and we love him. He's been a speaker here many times. He's a visiting fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute, an associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute in London, and a fellow of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. He has extensive aviation and defence experience, including flying fast jets, and maritime patrol force development, major equipment projects, and as a defence attaché. For his work at the Pentagon on force structure matters, he was awarded the US Secretary of Defence's Exceptional Public Service Medal. Peter has a doctorate from the University of New South Wales on grand strategy and has taught the topic at the Eisenhower School of National Security and Resource Strategy in Washington, DC. His research interests include grand strategy, national security policies, particularly relating to middle powers, defence force structure concepts, and the impacts of emerging technology. He contributes regularly to the public policy debate on defence and foreign affairs issues, and is the author of a book, Grand Strategy, and is co-authoring a new book, Warfare in the Robotic Age, which is out due in early 24. That's going to plan. It's good. A book launch. Goldilocks Defence Review, Defence Strategic Review, too hot, too cold, or just right. And he assures me that the three bears aren't from Russia. So Peter.
With a bio like that, you know this will be not a dry talk. No policy at all. Okay, let's get ourselves underway. Over some 7 months from August last year to February this year, 5 people came together to write a review of the Australian Minister of Defence on some specific defence and military matters. The review was the collective opinions of the 5 people. Everyone has opinions. According to the review in itself, it's just a large op-ed, except, crucially, for the 5-page preamble by the Defence Minister and the 7 pages tacked on the end, which are the government's responses to the review. These 12 pages may be considered government-endorsed defence policy gig. These 12 pages are the important bit and what we'll be focusing on. The other 89 pages, 58 leaving out photos, are personal opinions, even if they make clickbait headlines. Just a reminder of ancient history to avoid confusion. This review is often compared with Paul Dibb's 1986 Defence Review. The Dibb Review was considered and incorporated into the 1987 Defence White Paper. The 87 White Paper was effectively the government's response. Today's Defence Strategic Review is different in the manner the government responded. Its 12 pages are its response. In this talk, we'll firstly discuss the review process, key responses, its apparent shortcomings, and finally make an overall assessment. Is a review too cold, too hot, or just right? A well-defined need. As promised in its election campaign, the new Labor government quickly commenced the Defence Force Posture Review. This morphed into a seemingly more comprehensive Defence Strategic Review that reported in February. The summary we have was written by unknown public servants and released to the public in late April. The review built from a key determination of the last government's 2020 Defence Strategic Update, that the long-held assumption of a 10-year warning of the prospect of high-intensity military conflict was unsustainable. The Australian Defence Force, the ADF, might now be called on to fight at short notice, although how short was not defined. Increased military readiness was needed, and this meant adjusting ADF force posture and preparedness in terms of the supply of specialised munitions, logistic requirements such as fuel critical to military capability. In terms of actions, however, the 2020 update kept to the major capital acquisition timelines laid out in the 2016 Defence White Paper. There seemed a clear disconnect between declaring a reduced warning time and simultaneously planning a slow delivery of new ADF warfighting capabilities. An obvious example is the new submarine frigate programs not delivering until the late 2030s. The review aimed to resolve this cognitive dissonance. by undertaking quite specific tasks laid out in the terms of reference, which are up there, outlining the strategic challenge, examining estate, infrastructure, disposition, logistics and security investments, recommending changes in funding priority for current projects, and outlining preparedness and mobilisation needs to 2032-33. There is a close precedent. The 1986 DIB Defence Review that we mentioned suggested the military force needed for defending Australia, but was criticised at the time for assuming 10 years warning time. Alan Wrigley in 1990 wrote a report that used DIB's proposed military force, but through force posture changes, that is, in basing organisation and workforce, suggested ways to defend Australia with only 1 year's warning time. The review conduct. Since Wrigley in 1990, there have been many more defence reviews, many more. But these are focused mainly on management issues, such as fixing the equipment acquisition process and submarine maintenance. These reviews normally appointed an external, very important person, who then interviewed senior defence leaders and used their inputs to devise a solution. The Defence Strategic Review partly followed these earlier reviews. Even so, it's important to highlight that the review as a concept was innovative and imaginative. It was a new idea from the closed shop used in defence white papers before. To lay a placeholder down, not all innovations succeed. Some fail, but in failing inform future actions to be better and more effective. 2 external, very important persons were contracted: a retired Chief of Defence Force and an ex-Defence Minister. 3 others were added: an academic from the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, a current Army General, and a current senior civil servant from the Department of Defence. These 5 individuals made up a team whose collective opinions the review reflects. While couched in good bureaucratic speak, it was readily evident from the review's terms of reference that it was not created to change the force structure of the ADF. Moreover, there was no mention of new money, just thinking about existing funding being rejigged. The 2 independent leagues chosen clearly reflected this limited ambition, being more in the mould of cautious, wise old men rather than young Turks dreaming of a revolution in Australian military affairs. In this, the Minister and Prime Minister provided not just clear terms of reference, but some really sharp steers. Richard Marles, before the review began, stated the new government wanted to increase the range and lethality of the Australian Defence Force so that it is able to hold potential adversary forces and infrastructure at risk further from Australia. We will invest in the logistics, sustainment and depth required for high-intensity warfighting, including guided munitions. Complementing this, the Prime Minister argued that some of the Australian Defence Force's existing force modernisation plans were a reflection of the past 20 years of counterinsurgency across the greater Middle East, and thus inappropriate for the next 20 years of Indo-Pacific possibilities. In a rhetorical mood, he asked, are we going to be involved in a land war in central Queensland? Given all this, the review may be more properly seen as mainly involving adjusting the extant defence investment plan to the new government's guidance. The review is then tidying up around the edges in a technocratic planning sense. It now makes sense that the review undertook, so the media reported, very limited consultation. They spoke to within the Australian government, the US and UK defence organisations, some Australian branches of large overseas US and UK defence companies, and those think tanks that were either government owned or had one of the review team as members. The extensive consultation of some earlier reviews aimed at getting acceptance for change among insiders, industry, academia, the public and regional states was not seen as needed this time. The change sought was already well known. Now, if you thought that was boring, the talk now turns really boring. From what I've already said, you could yourself write the responses the government and department gave, and by implication, policy now sets out. Forego grand visions, big strategies or new ideas. Reviewers focused at lower levels. In this, it's perhaps surprising how little the review decided. There's a sceptical view that external consultants in the reviews always recommend more reviews. This review arguably excelled in this. The review called for some 18 or so more reviews and studies. Just some of these to give you the flavour. Analyse Navy's warship fleet by late 2023. Examine industry consolidation options for the Henderson shipyard south of Perth. That'd be exciting. Develop a comprehensive framework for managing cyber operations. Find a way to build and sustain a defence space workforce. Develop options to meet recruitment targets by 2024. undertaken an enterprise-wide audit to baseline defence estate infrastructure by the end of 2023, develop options to streamline and accelerate the acquisition process. I've left the other 11 out due to boredom. An impressive list of reviews will require a realised number of consultants and a sizable budget. What are you all still here for? You should be in Canberra doing some studies. At least one has already been outsourced to a retired American admiral. That is analysed Navy's warship fleet. The future of Australia's Navy is too important to be left to Australians. Right. The key agreed responses. Let's go through this fascinating slide. In terms of what the review itself advanced, let's go back to the terms of reference noted before. You can tell the policy here. Many of the government responses were simply re-announced, such as AUKUS is good, or administrative. Let's appoint a new 3-star general to solve defence personnel issues. Here we'll talk about the bigger issues the review responses covered. Don't be too disappointed. Firstly, outlining the strategic challenge. The strategic approach for defence planning will now be called national defence. Actually, quite a lot in that sort of adjective, but we're going to pick that right now. And will in the future involve, so we're told, genuine whole-of-government coordination. This raises the question of what is happening now, pretend whole-of-government coordination. Within this construct, the government will release an inaugural National Defence Strategy in 2024 that will give a comprehensive outline of defence policy, planning, capabilities and resourcing. This will be refreshed on a 2-year cycle to keep up with changes in the geostrategic environment. This will replace defence white papers, it seems. However, what will be in the new National Defence Strategy seems rather uncertain. It might be like an expanded version of the annual budget report. The National Defence Strategy might be a report of the past, not looking to the future. 2 other responses seem tossed in as stocking fillers, but are of interest. First, climate change appeared in a minor way. The government will work in partnership with states and territories to further develop national resilience response mechanisms to be included in the National Defence Strategy in 2024. Again, surely the federal government was working with the states and territories on disaster resilience now and in the past, but maybe not. Secondly, DFAT will be appropriately resourced to lead a nationally determined and strategically directed whole-of-government statecraft effort in the Indo-Pacific. There's some big thinking here. Leading implies DFAT planning future efforts and managing current ones across the whole of government, including defence. This would need resources in terms of DFAT getting additional skilled people, material and cash. On the other hand, review lead Angus Houston seemed to say statecraft is only diplomacy, that is just within DFAT, that is just by DFAT and within DFAT. Moreover, the recent budget didn't seem to actually funding the implementation of this exciting response, if you like, so its importance is unsure. Secondly, examining state infrastructure, disposition, logistics and security investments. Here the big ticket item is that upgrades and development of Australia's northern network of bases, ports and barracks should commence immediately. However, the government only agreed in principle, so immediately may be slower than you might think. Anyway, some developments are already well underway, but only after some US pressure. Other infrastructure recommendations, like a National Fuel Council, that have been agreed to in principle will be further studied and considered as part of the new National Defence Strategy in 2024. It will be a busy document full of many diverse bits and pieces. Thirdly, recommending changes in funding priority for current projects. In this section, there are many re-announcements and much banality, but there are some interesting issues. This government, like almost all before it, has decided the current capability acquisition process is not fit for purpose. Defence will now reform the process to more quickly buy equipment relevant to our strategic circumstances, with an emphasis on a minimum viable capability. The inference is Defence will try to buy equipment that can be bought quickly into service rather than seek the best, which could take a long time to come. The implication is less work for Australian industry, as items will be bought off the shelf from overseas. There's a lot of politics in all this. I expect little real change from the current state. The big news in this review task is some arming project shuffles. The government wants Army optimised for littoral operations and able to manoeuvre through sea, land and air, and to have much longer range weapons. History sometimes rhymes. This seems like a plan to disperse small Australian Army units across islands to our north to defend and lie in wait for passing hostile warships. Australia did that in World War II. The units concerned ended up in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Forward defence in a major war context needs to be really carefully thought about. It's not a throwaway line. The changes the Army now move seem on the surface like the full-scale transformation a part of the US Marine Corps is undertaking. However, the actual changes to today's Army appear limited, or at least small in scale. 3 existing smaller Army projects will be accelerated and expanded. They are firstly the Army Landing Craft project, already well underway. All tender responses being studied, with the first landing craft planned for delivery in 2026. Secondly, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, HIMARS project. Famously in use in the Ukraine as we talk, HIMARS fires long-range rockets from the back of trucks. Australia has already contracted to buy 20 HIMARS systems, which should arrive in 2026. Thirdly, the project to fit anti-ship missiles and wheeled vehicles to be fired from shore. While underway, this project is in its early stages. The losers are Army's big infantry fighting vehicle project, being cut from buying 450 to only 129 vehicles, and cancelling buying a second regiment of Army track vehicle mounted howitzers. Remember the quip about fighting a land battle in central Queensland. Lastly, outlining preparedness and mobilisation needs to 2032-33. Not much to report. The big item, admittedly only to be studied, is examining an increase of guided weapons and explosive ordnance stocks, including the rapid establishment of domestic manufacturing by second quarter 2024. This increase in manufacture has been examined for the last couple of years, albeit with no discernible progress. But I believe they've appointed a 1-star, so we're safe now. Right. Shortcomings. Summing up, leaving out the announceables that have been announced before in previous years, the big changes the review brought in are a lot of further reviews, cuts to 2 big armoured vehicle projects and a biannual national defence strategy. That's not much really. But wait, some of the pages of the review were understood to be withheld as they had been classified. I assume these pages are in a similar vein to the published pages. Could be wrong, maybe they're completely different, but no one can tell us if I am wrong. Again, the important parts are in the Minister's statement and the government agreed responses. This is a public defence policy for all of us to consider. So apparently, from what I understand, the Defence Strategic Review that was written by the team was about 150 pages long. So this one's about 100 pages shorter. So there's quite a lot that's not there. But sometimes brevity is the soul of wit. It did not square the circle. You'll recall the major reason for having this review was, of course, warning times before a major war started had sharply reduced. The previous and this government spoke of needing increased military preparedness to respond in time to fast-moving geostrategic circumstances. Little in the review seems to address this. But on the other hand, this shortcoming might be a good sign. At the moment, there's a gap between rhetoric and military preparedness. Maybe the rhetoric is just that, much ado about nothing. If the previous government and this government are not suddenly ramping up defence spending and stressing short-term military matters, then maybe Australia's security situation is not as dire as some politicians, defence commentators or media outlets suggest. Both governments are happy to leave off many actions until the 2030s and 2040s. This inaction suggests that these governments believe that today's geostrategic environment is not overly threatening. Nonetheless, in the real world, there is a security dilemma developing. Recent large-scale Chinese force expansion has given China the capability to wage a major war at short notice. This capability is now being displayed almost daily on China's Indian border, East China Sea, Taiwan, the South China Sea, around Korea, and in cyber intrusions globally. Moreover, the increasingly bellicose statements by Chinese leaders suggests a growing intent to use force to settle disputes. These actions and words are creating a response. The US and its allies, and much of the Indo-Pacific region, is gradually expanding their defence forces. There is a ratcheting up effect underway where no one feels safe, but we all feel concerned. Impactful projection. The review might be light on, but that doesn't mean there are not other actions being taken elsewhere. From before the review was launched, Minister Marles has used a somewhat odd phrase of impactful projection. That is, it says there, military power applied at a substantial distance from Australia has a meaningful strategic impact. It's a type of forward defence, being able to attack an enemy beyond Australia's borders. in particular attack targets in Australia's immediate region, defined as encompassing the northeastern Indian Ocean, through maritime Southeast Asia into the Pacific, and including Australia's northern approaches. I suppose it's the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea and into the Pacific Ocean. The idea is going bipartisan backing. Andrew Hastie, Opposition Shadow Defence Minister and an ex-Australian Army officer, is firmly in agreement, arguing for an ADF able to strike targets beyond the archipelago to our north, and suggesting acquiring bombers, precision-guided missiles, and air and sea unmanned autonomous vehicles. In the second half of this decade, this will be more than just words. Some 200 long-range anti-ship missiles are already being acquired for the Supermodern aircraft fleet out at Amberley. These have a 500-kilometre range. In addition, some 80 extended-range joint air-to-surface standard missiles are also being acquired for land attack purposes. These have a 1,000-kilometre range. The Navy is now getting the 150-kilometre range naval strike missile, an anti-ship weapon, about 150 or so, fitment to its 8 Anzac-class frigates and 3 Hobart-class destroyers. The Navy is also getting 200 Tomahawk Block 5 anti-ship missiles for the 3 Hobart-class destroyers. These have a 1,600-kilometre range. And as already mentioned, Army's getting 20 HIMARS rocket systems with a range of up to 500 kilometres. All this adds up to a sizable missile strike force. This map gives an idea of the areas covered by the impactful projection. The dark blue line is Navy Tomahawk. The 2 light blue lines are the Air Force firing stealth missiles, and it's the Army firing from their barracks in Darwin. Note the map assumes air-launched missiles launched from Super Hornets after 2 hours flying time and by ships after 2 days swimming. This is quite impressive. But it begs the question of what targets will these missiles be used to attack? Long-range strike missiles are a means to an end, not an end to a means. A major shortcoming of the review and current defence thinking is the lack of a strategy. There is no causal path that connects the missiles and the geostrategic outcomes sought. Without a causal path, how do you know what to invest in and what projects? There is just a vague belief that if a major conflict starts, victory can be gained by sinking several hostile warships. It is certainly strong in the AUKUS nuclear submarine narrative. Apparently, having some such submarines will deter war and stop it if it starts. This worked to a point in the Falklands War back in the early 1980s. A UK nuclear submarine sank an Argentinian old World War II cruiser, and Argentinian surface ships returned to port, never to be seen again. But on the other hand, the Brits lost several ships, pressed on and won. Vague beliefs may not be enough for victory in a major war. Hope is not a strategy. A strategy-free review. This is really the biggest shortcoming. Not developing a guiding strategy, the review on the responses has become simply a collection of diverse and disparate ideas. There's no golden thread linking all two together. The laundry list of future studies review seeks highlights this. Each study might be fine in itself, but how do they come together? The whole should be greater than the sum of the parts. There's a real danger each study will be standalone, where some are at odds with others. The lack of coherency in the review will then be replicated across future studies and analysis. Moreover, defence is a very large department with many widespread parts. It needs a high-level philosophical document that informs all involved to ensure coherency of actions, or at least try to ensure coherency of actions. That task was done previously by defence white papers. This review is nothing like a white paper and is unable to be a foundation text able to guide the whole department. Ukraine and the future of war. This brings us to the final shortcoming. There's little evidence in the policy set up by the Minister or the responses. Thought has been given to how war might be fought in the future. However, we all live in the future. It's kind of important to be future looking and preparing for a military force for an uncertain to tomorrow. Now, we'll now have 90 seconds of techno-babble on the future of war, just to please me, okay? Russia's war on the Ukraine defence is giving us a glimpse of the future. With modern technology, including drones, civilian smartphones and commercial space-based sensors, the battlefield has become transparent. Equipment and individual soldiers can be readily located and targeted for precision attacks that kill. The race is on to disperse and hide so as to avoid being destroyed, mainly through long-range fire. The future is seen as distributed operations, where forces disperse to survive while working together using long-range communications to coordinate the delivery of distant firepower. Physically massing, where many large platforms are concentrated in a single location, is now not seen as the key to tactical success, but a fast route to detection and destruction. These distributed operations are envisaged as cross-domain, where friendly firepower is so coordinated and integrated across the land, sea, air, space and cyber domains that it rapidly converges onto the adversary forces and overpowers them. This concept involves massive firepower without massive platforms. In this, it is the integration of technology, concepts and systems, more than mere foresight alone, that will determine victory. The character of war is changing around us. Australian defence needs to keep up with this. We'll move on from the techno-babble. An assessment, and we are nearing the end, so take hope. At the moment, it seems that the review's principal impact will be distracting people from other tasks. There are other things happening that might change defence, such as AUKUS, definitely, the other numerous reviews underway, or even the external world, but the review doesn't look like one of them. Minister Marles claims the review will underpin our defence policy for decades to come. This seems rather improbable. Review in the Goldilocks sense is too cold. It's a thin rule. Let's step back though. Who cares? Is defence of any importance in our daily lives or to the nation longer term? Review's 3 contractors cost less than $1 million and kept the Department of Defence busy and off our mind for more than a year. Maybe that's a fair trade. The fundamental problem with this is China. It is inconceivable that China would start a war. It was equally inconceivable in early 2022 that Russia would either. If countries have the capabilities to wage war, leaders can be crazy enough to start one. The Ukraine war stands out, but so does the Iraq war in 2002. Humans, as psychology studies and recent work in neuroscience show, are not rational thinkers. Leaders are humans just like all of us, and we are selective in the information that we base our actions upon. Crazy actions like starting wars are unfortunately far too normal. In the specific case of the hypothetical, you have to say it's really hypothetical, Great War between the United States and China, Australia winning and not losing would be important. Winning here defines a better peace after the war than before. Losing being the converse, being worse off after the war. For the last 80 years, Australia has outsourced worrying about winning to others. Noted Australian military historian Dennis Horner argues that the United States has done Australia's war-making strategic thinking for it since the 1st of October 1943, back then in the shape of General Douglas MacArthur, who stood at MacArthur Chambers that way.
That way, mate.
That way. I'm a navigator. Okay, so less than a block that way. Australia's today out of practice with such strategic thinking. ADF Colonel Michael Scott writes this is because of a lack of understanding about what strategy is, the absence of a traditional military strategy, and government organisational shortcomings. Getting serious about reorientating Australian strategic thinking, force structure and force posture to focus on fighting to win wars will take effort and time. In theory, the review is a part of this, but in practice, its impact appears marginal. However, this criticism might be right, but at the same time be off the mark at a more fundamental level. The review's main usefulness may be as a failed innovation. Not all innovations succeed. Failure is actually useful in highlighting what not to do. Next time Australia can now do better. The mooted, ill-defined national defence strategy, rapidly approaching, is the next opportunity. See what happens in 2024. Fingers crossed. And now the questions. Now, Ian had a question.
Good evening, Dr. Layton. All I can say is thank God we live in a lucky country. But if I was to pick an item from the whole repertoire with respect to the Goldilocks reference, I wonder when they were choosing the Hunter frigate design, they might have thought of Goldilocks when they chose ships that are too heavy and too expensive. They're overweight, they're undergunned. I understand that this decision is going to be reviewed at the end of the year, or there's an announcement at the end of the year. How do you think things will work out with respect to the Hunter-class frigates, firstly? Secondly, that's a BAE project, as I understand it. Is BAE the organisation behind the AUKUS submarine.
Yes, so,
I believe it
so
is there. I was
so the Hunter class destroyer project is what Australia's second largest defence project at the present time. The AUKUS is definitely the biggest, if you like. So the Government Audit Office over the last 5 to 6 years has had a lot of fun with defence, pointing out the fact that defence projects usually late, don't do what they said they would do, and cost a lot more. So there is room for the government to improve the defence acquisition process. As every government for the last at least 20 years has tried to. But the Hunter class frigate in itself is an interesting argument. So it's academic, if you like. Built as a 10,000, I mean, it's almost a 10,000 ton ship. It's a really big ship, sort of almost a battleship of World War I, if you like, designed to hunt and kill submarines. Well, that sounds good. But against that, of course, is we've got this very big ship with a bunch of people on board. At the same time, there's a lot of emerging technologies on the way. Artificial in intelligence, quantum. There's a whole pile of things out there that might mean that having a large number of very limited crew ships, or a large number of autonomous robots, etc., might be a better way to go than concentrating everything in a single platform, which is what I alluded to in the war in Ukraine. There was this massing of platforms may not be the answer. It might be massive firepower. I don't know what the American Admiral will decide about Australia's Hunter class frigate program. It's being built by the British firm BAES, so we have a sort of a tri-national involvement there. And yes, British, or BAES, I keep thinking British Aerospace, but BAES, as they call themselves now, is the major contractor for the AUKUS submarine project for the British part of it. You recall we're going to get some Virginia-class submarines to the Americans first, and then transition to a joint Australian-British project. Well, the contractor for that is BAES. So we have an interesting overlap there. We'll see what the American Admiral decides is good for Australia at the end of this year. But it does highlight that our defence strategic review was a bit narrow, and the future of the Navy is really a big issue that you would think would be included in the whole future of the AF as in wrapped up in some eye-pleasing law. You want to go on?
Over to you. Okay.
Paul can ask questions anytime.
As I understand it, a lot of this, particularly with the Navy, a lot of the problem is, quite aside from the technology and delivering it all, is just manning the platform. That is recruitment. So do you have an opinion on how that will be squared? Or because, again, as I understand it, it's not going to come from just our population. There's simply not enough skills.
Well, one of the other problems with the review, as the lead authors have pointed out at least twice, to my knowledge, was it did not take into account resources, whether that was money or people. So defence has a recruitment problem. Australia has always been short of skilled people. We've had 100 years. When I was a boy, we had 12 million people. We were desperately short of people. We have 26 million people. We're still desperately short of people. It's just one of those things that just goes around. So the Defence Department has never designed itself to take into account that we're short of people. It assumes that given more money, we can simply pay a lot more money and hire more people. So there's a tension there between dragging people out of the civilian world and working for defence. That tension's been going at least since the Second World War. Warning, the civilian world, generally speaking, wins the argument for a whole pile of reasons. Now, I'm sure you've all read the Courier Mail on a Sunday mentioned that defence recruiting targets haven't been met this year or something. They were almost met about 5 years ago, and now they're met about 80% of the targets met. So it's on a bad trend line. So the review did recommend recruiting an Army 3-star to fix that problem. So that's one recruiting problem solved. But this is truly a nightmare that requires a lot of thinking about this one, because defence can use up a lot of a large workforce. Against that, you will have all noticed over the last 100 years that the trend in defence workforces is to do a lot more with a lot fewer people. So the battlefield has emptied out a lot, if you like, and the future does belong to all those crazy robots out there.
Yeah.
But we do need to have a think about how we build a defence force that we can actually have people that can run it. Because there's no good buying 20 ships or something if you've only got enough crews for 5. And that's, you know, sort of that's sort of where we are now.
Peter, you spoke, I think, about a national fuel council. You certainly spoke about domestic ordnance and the need for us to, the review identified that as a critical need. Can you comment on that more generally? It strikes me as having a national fuel reserve as we have in Donald Trump's America in tanks over there does not really suit us when we need the fuel here. What did it say about the need for sovereignty? John Blaxland spoke a lot about it in terms of fuel, munitions, spare parts, ability to make spare parts. No good having the best equipment if it breaks down or can't be fueled. What did it say? What do you say?
Not much. So it did speak about having a national fuel council. It did speak about using some of the infrastructure in the north of Australia to supply fuel that the mining companies have. That sounds like a reasonable plan. So it found the problem but didn't address it, if you like. It said, "Oh, fuel's an issue." Yep, you're right there. But as John Blaxland sort of says, you know, we have a number of issues in Australia where the refineries are closing, so we can't refine our own fuel. Therefore, it must come from overseas. And there's a lot of flow-on effects in the chemical industry from that as well. But our refineries are small and in need of a lot of investment. But on the other hand, I'm now going back about a decade, so the figures today are probably more than what I'm about to say. But bear in mind, this was about a decade ago. So I looked at this about a decade ago. Australia, I know, had 6 or 8. We needed 6 to 8 large tankers a month to survive and keep the place going. How many tankers do you think there are in the world? 12,000. So actually, when you look at it from numbers like that, you think, well, actually, it could be like World War II, and we might be okay because there's enough tankers to go around. Even if we lose 1,000, there's still a couple left. But the difference between World War I, a major power war, World War II, major power war, are stark as far as fuel goes. In World War I, we supplied soldiers to the British to use on the Western Front. The British really didn't care what happened to Australia as long as we produced soldiers for them. So getting fuel out of the UK at that time, or even getting ships to export our wheat overseas, was extremely hard. That's why Billy Hughes tried to buy some, which led to a whole lot of other problems. In the Second World War, when the Japanese attacked, the Americans had a vested interest in providing us with fuel as well as spare parts and everything else. So from 1942 onwards, we were well resourced as far as all those low logistic items meant. But in those wars, those major wars where we send people overseas a long, long way away, say to Europe, then getting ships out to Australia is actually really hard. So we are a bit vulnerable there, if you like, on the sort of the waves of fortune. We don't know what will happen next. There's been innumerable fuel studies done over the years, and generally speaking, they try and invest in larger fuel storage. At the end of the day, we also need to get down our usage of fuel dramatically. The defence hasn't helped by buying equipment. That not only requires more people to operate, but uses a lot more fuel. So the fuel demands of defence now are significantly higher than they were even a decade ago. So we're compounding a problem here, and now that we're in the world of renewable energy, there are a lot of ways out there now using electrics and hydrogen, all sorts of other funny things that we can actually take a different approach. It'd be a 10-year plan, obviously, but defence probably needs to get with them to be like the Americans and start thinking about lowering its fuel requirements and all the other options there to try and make us less reliant upon liquid fuels from the Middle East.
Ted?
Defence technology moves quickly. It's very vital. And some of those things that happen in that area change the game entirely. You make your own list, but satellites, stealth, radar, whatever, it should completely change the game. And whoever is the developer of the next thing that is a game changer has a short-term advantage. The strategic review seems to not realize that we need to be in the game. They've outsourced our defense innovation as well as they've decided to outsource the platforms. What can you say about that?
So before the current government, the policy about innovation was that the Defence Science and Technology Organisation looked after quite a reasonable sum of money, if you like, a bucket of money, that took new ideas from being a new idea to, if you like, to being a prototype. A bit more than that, but that's roughly it, okay? Meanwhile, the Defence Acquisition Organisation went out and bought big things like sort of great big ships. So there was a gap between the innovation and this new prototype thing that some company in Rockhampton had to devise. That was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Actually, the Defence Acquisition Organisation actually buying it in numbers, that gap from prototype into production, if you like. Now that's a problem across the whole of Australia for all of our innovation. Has been moving, if you like, out of that tentative sort of scientific stage, if you like, into mass production. Current government has decided that they'll stop doing what they're doing and they'll come up with a new process that is seamless across this particular divide. In keeping with the DSR, devising the new process is going to take another 18 months, apparently, which really is quite a long time. It is a long time today because innovation is changing quite rapidly. We can get left behind very quickly indeed. There's a whole lot of, we've reached a certain level at the moment across Australia's small and medium-sized enterprises. There's a whole lot of good ideas out there, but actually getting them into production is going to be really hard. In the Ukraine, of course, the reverse applies. They're funding everybody that has a good idea because there's clearly a pressing need. So we're sort of in the middle there. We need to find some way to exploit all these good ideas, these new innovations, many of which are not billion-dollar ideas. They're relatively inexpensive, but they provide that little bit extra on the end, that little sort of extra margin that gives you the combat edge. But getting Australia's good ideas to being in that combat edge in actual service is proving quite difficult. I think maybe from a cultural point of view, across the Department of Defence, and maybe a bit of Australian sort of culture cringe, if you like. It is always easier to go out and buy a very large ships, if you like, rather than actually build something new and innovative yourself. Of course, bear in mind, as we discussed here, not all innovations succeed, so there will be some failures here. Governments don't overly like failures, but that's just the way that innovations work. Who wants to lead?
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Peter. You've spoken a lot about people and mostly about equipment, but you mentioned the word cybersecurity just once, and it's not in the strategy. And to my way of thinking, it should be almost front and centre. We know about the propaganda in every war, like Russia and Ukraine. It's very powerful. But there's another undermining of our nation. And if we look at the United States in the last 6 to 7 years, it has been foreign powers that have affected the voting system. And apparently we're under that kind of pressure as well. Is that a Defence Department matter, or where does it fit?
I was expecting that to be in that mobilisation part, about mobilising Australia, if you like, in that particular sense. but there was very little in the Defence strategic review about that. To a certain degree, Defence is a government department and it tends to look inwards, not sort of outwards, if you like. It sees itself in a little bubble, which is part of what I spoke about. Defence not being concerned about winning wars, that's somebody else's job. It's looking more within itself. It cuts to a bigger problem as well. Cyber is an issue that affects everybody in this room. Whereas Defence and the Defence Department are concerned about big things that sail across the ocean, and if you like, it is a state-centric military force. It likes focusing upon very specific things, the standard force-on-force military equipment stuff. It doesn't like focusing upon, if you like, the human-centric aspects, which are the things that affect each of us on a daily basis. And you have to say, cyber security at the moment is pretty poor, but it affects all of us all the time. And the future will get worse and worse. So it's a big issue that needs addressing. But in that human-centric stuff as well, there's issues like climate change as well, that the review glossed over and said, oh, well, Defence will only be used when things are really bad. Well, actually, sometimes they are really bad. Sometimes that's been pretty common over the last 5 years. So it's left off the issues, if you like, that affect us in favour of the big issues as fighter jets, nuclear submarines, and tanks, which, you know, they're more interesting anyway, aren't they?
I think our news and our media is building discontent in our community, and if it came down to a war, I don't wonder how effective we'd be.
Actually, to be fair, the Department of Homeland Affairs is under the new minister is certainly focused on that particular issue and about climate change. Claire O'Neill has some excellent speeches, at least, and shows promise there. But you're right. Undermining the population has been a common thing that enemies have done for centuries and centuries. Only now they can undermine us through each of our own personal device, which is really quite spectacularly sort of stunning.
Yes, social media is so strong, isn't it?
It is. Now, online.
Just got a few questions online. Could the point of the DSR be to trigger new thinking within the Defence establishment, knowing that Defence uses the review purpose to think through problems in a similar way to Ross Babbage's calls to use net assessment to create an adaptive force a few years ago?
That's certainly a charitable view. But when I said the innovation, Peter Jennings of Aspie's fame for years thought that they needed some fresh thinking from outside. The trouble about being inside is that inside you don't just get groupthink, but you also get repetition of the thought of the senior man in the room, and occasionally a senior woman in the room as well. So I'm not too sure the Defence Strategic Review, the way it's done, will actually spark that fresh thinking. It seems to have it's perhaps the danger of all these things is that it stops fresh thinking in the sense of we've now decided this. You can be a team player, so sign up to it. So there are some dangers there. We'll see what happens. I mean, there's a whole pile of reviews going on. We have the National Defence Strategy next year. Maybe that will be a revolution in military affairs in Australia. At the moment, that's probably an open question. Nobody knows.
Another one here from Michael. From a strategic perspective, how do you apportion the challenge of achieving defence strategic procurement in the short government power cycle?
Yeah, governments don't seem to have any trouble about ordering things that take 20 years to come, I have to say. That way, when they're back in power, they can say that they ordered it, I suppose. People put a lot of faith in, or people have a lot of concern about short governmental cycles versus Xi Jinping, who's obviously there for the next 30 years. He can set things running, but there is a lot of groupthink going on, and people are doing as they're told. So I'm not convinced that problems are necessarily because government changes over quickly. Ministers certainly change over at breathtaking speed, and ministers take time to get up to speed and understand what the department's telling them. And the Defence Strategic Review, like white papers, are designed where the department brings the minister up to speed. Got that? But the minister is more, if you like, is a person who's appointed because he's charismatic and he can convince the people in his local electoral district to vote for him. He's not elected because he's a military strategist. So there's quite different skill sets there. Ministers are more people who will mobilise the public. So as Shirley pointed out, they're mobilising people. That's what Defence needs the minister to do, if you like, and get the big bucks is what the department would say. So I don't think the short cycle government is the principal issue here in defence acquisition matters.
One final question online. Your discussion about missile long-range fires ignores the challenges of targeting, including avoidance of neutral targeting. What is your view on the usability of long-range missiles? And that one's from Christopher Skinner.
Yeah. So we've been planning to use missiles with 120, 130 kilometre range since Australia has, since at least the 1980s. So back then there were a whole pile of techniques and procedures in place to avoid hitting neutral shipping or your own shipping at that. Bear in mind, while I said Australia would have a couple of hundred of these things, it's actually not that many. You don't want to waste any. It's really important to have excellent targeting so you hit the right place at the right time. You don't want to hit a neutral ship. Certainly in a war in the Pacific, there's not just warships out there, there's an awful lot of other people as well. So that kind of clever intelligence it is a priority. Having said that, there's a lot of it available now. If you wish to, as an ordinary person, you can go online. You may have to pay a little bit of money, but someone will sell you where sort of whatever ship that you're looking for, where it is at the present time. There's an extraordinary amount of quite deep, quite fine detail about ship movements around the world, going by commercial organisations, principally using a whole pile of commercial space-based sensors, both optical, receiving radio signals from the ground, and also radar satellites now. So finding surface ships is remarkably easier than it was even say 30 years ago. They really do stand out well, especially if they're 10,000 tonnes. Now, what's the question?
Oh, yeah. So in my understanding, there seems to be an issue with like high-ranking government officials like Kim Beazley and Christopher Pyne going into defence contracting immediately after they leave in projects that they initiated. Is this an issue with defence about like ministers and high-ranking officers taking money for consulting, and how does that affect it?
There's huge conflict of interest problems here, which have become apparent with the PricewaterhouseCoopers business at the present time. I never feel comfortable about the conflict of interest issues. Well, I have to say Australians are a bit unique about this. Most other nations don't. When I worked at the Pentagon, I worked for a while for the Deputy Secretary of Defence, and he'd just come out of a major US defence contractor and become the Deputy Secretary of Defence. But he wasn't taking any money because he was still on a retainer from the major contractor. So we all look at that askance. But everyone else said, "Isn't that fantastic service? He's not trying to rip off the country. He's doing the right thing by us all." So there are different ways to look at this. So conflict of interest is a real interesting one. I don't know whether depends how much they can swing things. I mean, companies hire retired generals for about 3 years after they've left, because they can open doors for them with the current hierarchy in defence, hoping to get some sort of inside edge there. And maybe that works sometimes. Maybe it doesn't other times. It's really hard to pin down. It's something that we all think is bad, but try and find the evidence to prove it. It's a lot more difficult.
Okay. Follow-ups. Can I ask what is obviously a very naive question? What's the primary goal of our defence strategy? Is it to win the next war or to prevent the next war?
I would put that down into the winning part of it. Winning is preventing the next war. That's the big aim, is to deter war, as in not to have one. Because a war is really a grand strategic failure. It should never have happened, because you should have changed the world, if you like, to make sure that did not happen. And you will have seen just the talk that the Prime Minister gave at the Shangri-La Dialogue last week. He stressed building bridges with everybody, whether it's China, but particularly Southeast Asia and across the region, to engage everybody deeply and try and make sure that war does not happen. So we need to be very careful not to talk ourselves into a conflict. So there's certainly a big effort underway there, and defence in that particular sphere, if you like, of engagement does have a role to play. But that's also a bit of whole of government, whole of nation as well. It's sort of keeping the peace, like winning the war, is not just something that only the military do. One last.
Dr. Layton, thanks for your presentation. You had an interesting graphic before about the relative ranges of a couple of missiles, which...
and you'd like to sell me some more?
I just wanted to ask your view about, that's the one, is the acquisition or the inclusion strategy of these missiles a reflection of the fact that maybe the deployment of the ADF won't be from Australia, but rather part of a joint force in other parts of the region, and the usefulness of those missiles if that was to occur in the future?
So if you sit back for 1 second, and as soon as people start talking about major war and about China and all that stuff, Australia is a middle power. It doesn't fight great powers, okay? So we ain't going to be doing it by ourselves. So if such a circumstance occur, it'll be a collective action. So it is very much part of the region and with other players. Australia is not going to be doing this alone. The exception to the rule is the Ukraine, which is now fighting, if you like, a great power all by itself, but ably supported by others. So that's probably a fallback case that we could get into, but it seems pretty unlikely. We have pretty much been signed up for collective defence, which is the United Nations policy as well. I have to say, we shall stand together rather than fall individually.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I must say though, I always look at that and I think F-111's range, 2,000 kilometres, add 2,000 to that, but anyway, we don't have them anymore. Thank you for a wonderful speech talk tonight, and putting really everything in context, and also your wonderful style in terms of delivering it. I'm so delighted that you were able to do it tonight and found it extremely informative. So on behalf of the audience, both here at Holding Redlick in Brisbane and also online, can I thank you?